Antony and Cleopatra. "Venus!" cried the excited people of Tarsus. "Venus has come!" they cried, as they crowded the waterfront of that city in Asia Minor late on one summer afternoon. "Venus has come to visit Bacchus!" they cried to one another, watching as if in a dream the most beautiful Egyptian galley they had ever seen, gliding up the river out onto the lake before them. They had been expecting Cleopatra. They had known she was coming to meet Antony there in the city of Tarsus. They had been prepared to see a gorgeous Egyptian galley with purple sails and oars of silver, even a golden stern, but no such ship as this. This was one of such unearthly beauty as to have come only from that immortal cloudland of the gods. Music drifted to their ears as it drew nearer, strange enchanting melodies on harps and flutes and pipes. Exotic, too, was the scent of spices and the pale blue drifting smoke of incense. Youths, beautiful as young gods, could be seen standing at the helm in rudder. Girls in draperies thin as evening mist were poised so lightly in the rigging as to be seen to be floating in the air. Beings from another world, attendants, courtiers they may well be, of an immortal queen. And there, see, there beneath the golden canopy, the reclining figure, was that not a goddess? There, in the shimmering robe and the high shining headdress, that radiant creature, could that be anyone but the immortal Venus, queen of love and beauty? "Venus!" cried the people, carried along by their imagination, until, for then, fancy had turned into fact. Venus had come to visit Bacchus. Let someone go to Antony at once, bid him come quickly to welcome this heavenly visitor. Antony was easily found, though not attired like Bacchus, not that afternoon, but as a Roman magistrate. Seated in the public square of Tarsus, he had been holding court, deciding arguments between petty rulers and ambassadors, among them, as usual, Jews complaining about Herod. Although the square had been almost emptied of people by the ship's arrival, Antony still sat there, struggling to look dignified and to control his curiosity. He, too, had been expecting Cleopatra. He had sent an ambassador to Egypt, asking the queen to meet him there in Tarsus, and he was very glad that she had come. He had need of her. The cities of Asia had been taxed and retaxed and squeezed out of almost their last cent. But there was gold in Egypt, if it could be had, and gold was what he needed. For now, Antony was beginning to think of undertaking the campaign which Julius Caesar had been planning just before he died. Lands yet to be conquered farther east were now tempting him, as they had tempted Caesar. Babylonia, Persia, all that fabulous land east of the Euphrates River which now belonged to Parthia, the only undefeated rival of the Romans. "Come ashore and have dinner with me," was the message Antony now sent to Cleopatra. Her reply was an invitation to come aboard ship instead and dine with her. It would give her pleasure, she assured him. Antony accepted. Why refuse a lady pleasure, especially a lovely one? And so, with that invitation and acceptance, one of the world's most famous love stories began. Some of Antony's officers and certain dignitaries of the city had also been invited. Daylight had faded into dark when they reached the harbor. Myriads of tiny lights outlined the ship and were reflected in the water. On board, everywhere, The tiny lights were multiplied 1,000 times in the mirrors, in the wine, in the glistening jeweled gown of Cleopatra, in the wondrous pearls hanging from her ears. It was a fairyland. Antony was spellbound at once by the fascinating queen, now, to him, even more glamorous than she had appeared in Rome when she was there with Caesar. To Cleopatra, the big Roman, too, seemed more attractive, by far, than her memory of him. She admired his hard muscles as he lay stretched out on his dining couch, which was laid just beside her own. The feast was a lavish one, rare, delicious food served on platters of gold. The plates, too, were of gold. The golden drinking cups were studded with jewels. "They are all yours, all of them," Cleopatra said to Antony when the feast was over. "They are nothing, truly, just a small remembrance," she added lightly, slowly withdrawing her slim fingers from his large hand, which had closed over them too long in parting. And they were, those plates and cups of gold, a mere fraction of the treasure which Cleopatra had brought with her for a definite purpose. She wanted to dazzle Antony, to convince him of the vast wealth of Egypt that might be his if he would share his power in the Roman world with her. If Antony would lay claim to Rome in the name of little Ptolemy Caesar, all the riches and power in the world might be theirs together. Why should Antony support Octavian, Caesar's nephew? Was not Caesar's own son a more rightful heir to his father's power? Alone, without help, Cleopatra knew that she could do little for the future of her 7-year-old son. She saw clearly that in days to come he might not even have the throne of Egypt left to him. With unfriendly rule in Rome, Egypt, instead of being allowed to remain an independent kingdom, might be made just another province in the Roman Empire, and the rule of the Ptolemies would end. But if she could only persuade Antony that his best chance lay with Egypt, then the brightest future possible might be ahead of them. With so much at stake, Cleopatra had now come to Tarsus, prepared to use all of her wit and charm upon Antony, to dazzle him with her riches, to hail him as a god, to promise him her love, herself, all that she had to give, in return for his alliance. Her favorite ladies in waiting were eagerly watching for her to awake the following morning. As soon as they saw her eyelids flutter open, they knew that she was in high spirits, and that the first evening had been a great success. There was lilting music in her voice as she called in Ethiopian to the slave girls who prepared her bath, and spoke to each attendant in their native language, for she spoke them all. Catching her gaiety, they planned to outdo themselves and make their lovely lady even more bewitching for the feast that evening. Which tunic should she wear? Which would display her graceful figure to the best advantage? What jewels? How many necklaces? Which bracelets and earrings? And how should her hair be tressed? Bound in the Greek fashion, or coiled back softly, leaving a frame of small tight curls about her face? These and 100 other delightful details were all to be decided later, when Cleopatra herself was seated at the dressing table. It was then a question of which rouge to use, what perfume would be most seductive. Should the clear arch of her eyebrows be made a trifle blacker, and the eyeshadow on the lower lid applied with a swan's feather? Should that not be drawn just a little farther toward the corner of her eyes? "Am I beautiful? Do I please you?" Cleopatra laughed as they admired their handiwork. "This night, as you know, my dears, and each night must excel in every way the night before it. The banquet of the second night was more splendid than the first, and that of the fourth night was so resplendent that Antony declared that it would be impossible to excel or even equal it in luxury. No one, he wagered, could spend more on a single feast. "I accept your wager," said Cleopatra with a tantalizing smile. "I could spend 10,000,000 sesterces on food alone, and I shall prove it. Shall we say tomorrow night?" At first the feast of the next night appeared no different from the others, to the disappointment of the guest, but to the satisfaction of Antony, who felt that he had won the wager. But wait, at the end of the last course, Cleopatra was beckoning to a slave. A tiny jewel-encrusted cup of gold was set before her, and filled with vinegar. Raising her hands, she removed from her ear one of the two precious pearls. Watching Antony as she did so, she then dropped it into the little cup, waited a moment for it to dissolve, and then drank its contents. A gasp of shocked astonishment went up from all who saw the wanton destruction of this rare pearl, worth easily half of the amount wagered, for all believed the pearl had been dissolved, except perhaps the very clever little person who had swallowed it. "Stop!" exclaimed the officer chosen to decide the wager, as he saw her reaching for the other. "Do not destroy it! You have won!" Cleopatra had won. She had won the wager, and she had won Antony. His heart went with her when, at the end of a few weeks, she returned to Egypt, where, it had been decided, he was to shortly follow her. All desire for an immediate campaign against Parthia had now faded away before a far more glamorous prospect of a winter in Alexandria spent with Cleopatra. Alexandria was the Paris of the ancient world, its most beautiful and sophisticated city, one in which every kind of pleasure was available, from the highest of the mind and spirit to the lowest of the senses. In all of them Antony was indulged. It was a winter of extravagant delight, that winter which united the most powerful Roman in the world with the world's most glamorous queen. Their union, although sanctioned by the Egyptian priest, was outside of the Roman law. But what did that matter? Were not queens and rulers above common law? Could Venus and Bacchus be bound by the ties of the mere mortal world? They could not. And so deeply in love were Antony and Cleopatra that they quite forgot about the Roman world until early spring, when suddenly bad news broke through their enchantment. News traveled slowly by land during the winter months when the Mediterranean was rough, but with spring the ships came again, and they brought bad news in this spring of 40 B.C., both from Rome and from Asia. Antony tried to turn a deaf ear to the loud calls for help, but it was impossible. At home in Rome, Fulvia, Antony's disagreeable and now jealous wife, had stirred up trouble with Octavian to the point of war. In Asia, the king of Parthia, not waiting for Romans to make war on him, had invaded Syria and seized Roman territory. Bad business in both places. Uncertain which place to go to first, Antony set out for Asia Minor. From there he could go either way. Cleopatra watched him leave with a very heavy heart. He kissed her briefly in a hurried parting, assuring her that he would soon return, and that they would rule the world together, and for her to be good and not to worry. Then, while she watched, his ship disappeared from sight. And what had she left? Only promises. Could she trust him? Would these vague promises be kept, she wondered, feeling quite alone now and deserted. 4 years she would have to wait and wonder, for it was to be 4 years before Cleopatra would see Antony again, or before he would see the twins, his twin baby boy and girl, who were to be born that summer, Alexander the sun and Cleopatra the moon.